All right, girls, welcome to my podcast on Hellenistic Greek art and just a little bit of a review for your test tomorrow. I think last time, or where I left off, was with the late classical period. I just wanted to show you one more sculpture from the late classical period. This is Weary Heracles by Lysippos, and this was actually in your worksheet that you did for homework, so you should already know a little bit about this. What I want you to remember about a lot of this sculpture from the late classical period and even going into the Hellenistic period is that gods and goddesses are still depicted, though they are much more humanized now. And what do I mean by that? Well, Weary Heracles here is clearly exhausted. He's looking down. He still has that idealized body, but he looks much more like a human being. He doesn't have the sense of pride, and he's not looking straight out at the viewer. And, he's exhausted. He's not like a glistening athlete like we've seen in some of the classical statuary, such as the Doryphorus, okay? So it's a much more human god, as you can see here. The other thing that I want you to remember is the three sculptors, the three Greek sculptors, Praxiteles, Scopas, and Lysippus. And another thing is that sculptures by these artists can no longer be found. There are only marble copies left. And the three things that you want to remember about the marble copies are, one, they needed the little tree trunk addition here to help the marble statue stand up, which was not needed with bronze. They had less detail than bronze sculptures. We especially see that in the Aphrodite of Knidos, which I covered in my last podcast. Bronze sculptures contained a lot more detail. They were a lot more lifelike than these marble copies. So you want to remember those two things. Okay, moving along. This is also by Lysippos. He was Alexander the Great's favorite sculptor. So any image of Alexander the Great was most likely done by Lysippos. And remember, he was known for that emotional intensity. He would always depict Alexander with this flowy hair and the deep-set eyes. So it always had this sort of sense of tension in his sculptures. And he was the favored sculptor by Alexander the Great. Moving along, I want to show you this Corinthian Column capital. You have a sheet with the three different column types on there: Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian. Corinthian columns become more popular in the late classical and especially in the Hellenistic period. And this column type was also favored by the Romans, who we're going to be studying next. And if you remember in class, I told you that the Romans greatly admired Greek art and architecture, and they adopted this column style. Do you remember what type of leaves are here in the column capital? Acanthus leaves. So finally, we're at the Hellenistic period. The beginning of the Hellenistic period is around 323 BCE, and historians generally decide the beginning of the Hellenistic period by the death of Alexander the Great. He was only in power for a short time. He died when he was 33, but his empire extended all the way into Egypt and Syria. It was very, very large. And if you remember me talking about sort of Greece becomes this very cosmopolitan area. So you see lots of different ethnicities. You see more of an urban setting. So there's poverty, there's plagues. I forgot to mention that at the end of the late classical period and into the Hellenistic period, a great plague sweeps through Greece, and actually a lot of people are wiped out from this sickness. So what you will begin to see in Greek Hellenistic sculpture is a more realistic take on human beings. So no longer are we seeing beautiful idealistic views of gods and goddesses. We actually see suffering. We see the poor being depicted. and we see more trivial activities being depicted in sculpture. And before I show you some of those Hellenistic sculptures, I want to talk to you about Hellenistic architecture. This would be a perfect example if you chose to talk about architecture for your essay and your test. So this is the Temple of Apollo. This is in modern-day Turkey, begun in 313 BCE. Obviously, this is a restored view and plan of the temple, and it was actually open to the sky, unlike most Greek, archaic, and classical temples that had roofs. This one was actually open. But you can see it was very, very grand in scale. It was classical in that it was symmetrical, it was very orderly. Remember, the Greeks loved that proportion. They focused on proportion and mathematics in their architecture and in their temples. But look at how many columns are in this temple. There's quite a few. And in my next slide, I have a little comparison so you can see. Okay, there we go. So you can see the archaic plan. This is the plan of the Temple of Hera I, an archaic Doric temple. Moving into the classical period, you have the Parthenon, which you should be very familiar with by now, which incorporates both archaic and classical elements. Remember, it had the Doric columns on the outside and then the Ionic columns on the inside. And then finally, your Hellenistic example is the Temple of Apollo. Of architecture in the Hellenistic period that's really important is this the Stoa of Attalus II, and this is part of the Agora in Athens. And I gave you a handout on the Agora of Athens that I'd like you to read. The Agora is part of your required images from the College Board, so it's important that you know what the function of the Agora was. And it actually contained a lot of different things. It had a marketplace, it had temples, so people could come and worship there. It was also a public space where people could come and debate. Remember, this is a democratic society. It also had a mint where Greek coins were made. Remember the drachma. So it was a very important public space that was located in the city-state of Athens. So it's important that you know about the Agora and make sure you read over that handout that I gave you. Another required image from the College Board is the Altar of Zeus, which is actually gigantic. It's huge, and it's one of the most famous Hellenistic sculptures. As you can see, and we'll take a closer look at some of these reliefs, many of them are high reliefs in that they are, really coming away from the architectural background. There's a lot of writhing movement. There's a lot of emotion. There's a lot of dynamic figures within this frieze. And it has, it's almost 400 feet long, and it has over 100 life-size figures in it. So it's quite gigantic. And here's another image from the Altar of Zeus. This is Athena battling Alkyonios. And this is a detail of a gigantomachy frieze. Remember that term, gigantomachy, gods battling giants. So look at how much movement is present here. You have Athena in the center. She's grabbing the hair of Alkyonios. So it's, again, displaying the power of Athena, the patron goddess of Athens. It's made of marble. And then I have a little comparison slide for you so we can compare Hellenistic relief sculpture with archaic relief sculpture. So here you can see a comparison slide of a relief sculpture from the Siphnian treasury, and this is from the archaic period, with this detail from the Altar of Zeus from the Hellenistic period. Okay, so what differences do you see? Okay, hopefully you're noting that the figures here are much more independent from the wall that they're attached to. There's obviously a lot more movement here. There's a lot more realism in both the bodies of the figures as well as the faces of the figures. There's a lot more emotion in the faces. Also, look at the drapery. Look at how detailed the drapery is. There's a lot of deep incising there, so it almost looks like it's swirling or moving. So, you know, a huge change from archaic Greek relief sculpture to Hellenistic Greek relief sculpture. So another really important Hellenistic Greek sculpture that you need to know, it's a required work by the College Board. It's the Nike of Samothrace. And what's amazing about it is not only the realism of the figure, again, you have that wet drapery look, but again, the motion that you can see here. It almost looks like this figure has landed and her wings are outstretched. So lots of motion, lots of showing of the human figure, showing of the body. And this was actually part of a huge fountain. So originally, in the next slide, you can see like a restoration of what it might have looked like. So, you know, you can see she once had a head, she was holding a laurel wreath, and she was set upon this naval ship, which would have had water rushing around it. So it would have been a very, very dramatic scene. And again, it attested to Athenian pride, Athenian power. So very important sculpture. And today, actually, it is located in the Louvre in Paris. So if you ever get to Paris, definitely put this on your list. So you can see that, again, in many of these other Hellenistic sculptures. This is a perfect example. This is the sleeping satyr, you know, overt nudity, and just gods and goddesses doing things that they wouldn't do in classical or especially in archaic Greek sculpture. This is the seated boxer, which we talked about in class, another important sculpture that you need to know about. And then I think this is another really good example of a Hellenistic Greek sculpture. This is called the Old Market Woman. So this is depicting, you know, an old woman, poor, from the lowest rung of the social order in Greece. She has a wrinkly face, her body's kind of hunched over. So that we wouldn't see anything like this in classical sculpture or in archaic sculpture. So we've gone from the idealized to a very, very real depiction of a Greek person. The last Hellenistic sculpture that I want you to know is this one. It's called Laocoon and His Sons, and he was a Trojan priest who tried to warn the Trojans that the Greeks were hiding in this big wooden horse that was supposed to look like it was a gift. So the Trojans haul this wooden horse into their city, and then in the middle of the night, the Greek soldiers come out of the horse and attack the city. So he tried to warn them, and the gods actually punished him for doing so because they wanted the Greeks to win the war. So they sent serpents to kill him and his two sons, and that's what you're looking at here. So again, perfect example of Hellenistic sculpture. Lots of movement, lots of emotion, lots of detail and realism. So another perfect example. And if you have time, definitely watch this little YouTube video about it. Quickly, I'm going to just review a couple things for your test. So the test is mostly about ancient Greece. There's a sprinkling of questions from chapter 4, which I'm going to try to touch on. But definitely know about the Nike of Samothrace, know about the evolution of archaic architecture through Hellenistic architecture, know about the evolution of archaic Greek sculpture through Hellenistic Greek sculpture, know about vase painting, red vase painting versus black figure vase painting, and yeah, that's all I can think of right now. So I wanted to show you a mural here. So this is Minoan art. So this is from Crete, and the thing I wanted to point out was the men and women. Remember how we talked about Minoan men and women were distinguished in their art by the women having fair skin and the men having the dark skin, but they also had the cinched waists and the long curly hair. So I want you to remember that. If not, I'm almost out of time. So I will tell you to just review your worksheets and some of the vocabulary, review your quiz, and play the Jeopardy, and good luck on your test.